naked body protest. This is part of a bigger project. It was part of my PhD, and the title of my PhD was Affective Dimensions of Naked Body Protest. But today we're going to focus on one part of the findings, which is the afterlife of naked body protest. And what you see on the screen there is a still from one of the videos that was taken by the SABC back in 1990 on the 12th of July. And we're actually in the month of July. So this marks 33 years since this particular protest happened. This is where the Danson women protested naked against the apartheid government for housing. So basically, if this presentation was happening on the 12th of July, it would be exactly 33 years. But today is the 7th, so it's almost 30 years. And this is a picture from the Star newspaper. The Star newspaper was also there when the Dawsonville women protested naked against the apartheid government for housing. So I'll just give a little bit of context before I get into today's discussion. The naked body has been a means of protest amongst African women dating back over a century. Once a working class women's form of protest, naked protests have seen an upsurge in the past 2 decades and have become increasingly common in the middle class university spaces and national events, such as the Presidential Summit Against Gender-Based Violence and Femicide that was held in Irene in Pretoria back in 2018. So my study sought to understand naked body protest through the lens of affect and feminist theory with a view to contributing to the psychology of naked body protest. The study is organized around 4 areas of interest. The first one is an exploration of how women might use naked body protest as a form of decolonial praxis. The second one is the psychosocial role that is played by naked body protest. And then the third one is the possible meanings of the different parts of the body exposed during the naked body protest. So what does it mean when the women expose the breast or the buttocks? The fourth one, which is the discussion today, is the afterlife of naked body protest. So how do we theorize the body? Greek philosopher Plato described the body as a betrayal of and a prisoner for the soul, reason or mind. So for Plato, reason had to rule over the body. In continuing Plato's work, Descartes distinguished between the thinking substance, which is the mind, and the extended substance, which is the body, something known as dualism today. So usually in comments ridiculing naked women's protest, women are often implored to be reasonable and to find less embodied forms of protest. They are asked to discipline their unruly bodies. Elizabeth Grosz indicates that the mind or reason has mostly been coupled with maleness, while the body has been coupled with femaleness. She explains that French philosopher René Descartes conceived of the body as always interfering with and as a danger to reason. So let's have a brief definition of affect. What is affect? There are many definitions of affect depending on what school of thought you're following or who you are following or who you're writing about. Affect can be understood as bodily capacity or the ability to affect and be affected. This is according to Mathebula. Wetherell, on the other hand, explains that affect can include every aspect of emotion, or it can sometimes refer to just the physical disturbances of the body. For example, the sobs, the blushes, and the snarls. She cautions, though, that there is no neat definition of the concepts of affect, emotion, and feelings. She explains that affect can be seen as the processes involved when events hit the body. Sarah Ahmed, on the other hand, explains that emotions involve bodily processes of affecting and being affected. That emotions are a matter of how we come into contact with others and objects. Ahmed does not question what emotions are, but is interested in what these emotions can do. So for instance, the assembling of naked women in protest may surface fear in the police, but the sight of police my study was based on 4 data sources. I interviewed 16 women who had participated in naked body protests for different reasons. I also used 2 radio podcast interviews where 2 of the women who participated in naked body protests were interviewed. And then I used a video recording of a protest staged by working class women against the destruction of their homes in Dobsonville in Soweto on the 12th of July 1990. Then I also analyzed the comments of YouTube videos where some of these women who had recently taken part in the naked body protests were being ridiculed. 4 significant findings came up. I found out that affects generated by naked body protests can inform decolonial praxis and can play a psychosocial role in advancing strivings for freedom. I found out that psychosocially, the expression of transgressive affects such as rage, anger, and self-love during naked body protests enables women protesters to work towards collective decolonization. The 3rd finding was that affect can be a generative lens through which the body speaks. So the exposure of different parts of the body, the breast, the buttocks, the vagina, convey different specific messages during naked body protests. And finally, which is what we're going to look at today, that naked body protests have an afterlife. So even long after they have happened, they can still affect the women who took part in those naked body protests. So we often look at the work or the results that come up after the protest, but we never look at the women protesters themselves. What are they left with? What baggage are they left to deal with decades after the actual protest? So I'm going to look at 3 different effects that they have to deal with. First one will be mental health after effects, followed by shame, and then exclusion and stigmatization. So this part of the findings examines the afterlife of transgressive naked body protests. It explores how life has been in the time following the protest of the women who have taken part in naked body protests. And I also found out that there's little written about this psychological after effects of the protest. Mental health. I'm just going to read out some of the accounts from the women who I interviewed. So here I interviewed a woman who protested in the RU reference list protest interview, and I called her Loli. I used pseudonyms to protect the identities of the women. And I actually came here all the way to Makanda to interview the women, so I'm back here now to report back on the findings. Loli recounts how she herself went through a mental breakdown for a couple of weeks following the protest. She says, I think I slid into a depressive state. I was like that for a couple of weeks, for longer even. And then Tsitsi says, and my involvement in that protest was very deep for me. It was not just being in solidarity. So I think that, she says, I just sat on the bed and I just zoned out. I would not respond to anything. So she called my warden, and then my warden decided to call the ambulance. The ambulance came, the ambulance took me to hospital, and I was hospitalized for 3 days. Now let's look at the shame that the women have to go through even years after the incident. This is one of the leaders or the women who protested in 1990 in Dobsonville. She says to me, just imagine, today I'm watching this video with you. Let's say you're my granddaughter. Tomorrow I will be watching with your child. But Granny was crazy to go naked. Look at her. Now they speak this modern English, and then she smiles. What was she trying to do? Then when you try to discipline them, obviously they don't listen to you because you protested naked as their granny. Why should they listen to you? You are a crazy woman. This particular quotation comes from a woman who participated in Peace Must Fall. She says, when I came back home, but it was twofold because they were protesting against fees and also the outsourcing, against the outsourcing of services and fares. So this was an older woman who was participating in solidarity with the students. When I came back home, There's a boy who said to me, Mama, what you did was embarrassing. I said to him, my child, thank you. When I did that, I was fighting for my rights, and I was also fighting for your rights. Going forward, you will be able to get a job. And then he said, but Mama, it was shameful. Don't you have shame? I said to him, no, I don't have shame. I was angry, and I wanted it to be known that I was angry. I wanted that anger to come out. I want my rights, my children's rights, and yours too. I want the whole thing. So, although some of the Dobsonville women experienced shame, their nakedness became an effective and affective intervention, which brought the police to a standstill and made some of them retreat and refrain from demolishing their checks. Al-Qasim argues that when wronged, the injured party may expose themselves to show what the other's harm has wrought. The bare body of the wrong, especially the bare body of an elderly woman or mother, holds a mirror to the shame of the wrongdoer or the perpetrator and materializes it in the visual field. From an intersectional perspective, we can see how Lee's experienced sexism and how ageism, because of the boy that felt that as an elderly woman, she was not supposed to expose her body in public, as according to him, it was embarrassing. Still continuing with shame. So Busi says, so I think that the most violent thing is to see the shaming coming from women. Even when I hit moments of debating that topic on social media, a few days after, I was always debating women and not necessarily men, which is something that's very exhausting because I'm not excusing men's behavior on that, or maybe condoning it, but I would say I'll take a different struggle when I fight with a man over these issues. But it becomes something completely different from a woman because you expect them to understand. I'm almost done. And then below are some of the quotations that came from YouTube comments. Someone said, Lord, some of those breasts look like drips. So it is important to note that some of the above comments were posted by women mocking other women protesters instead of protecting them and standing in solidarity with them. So what are the lessons that I learned from this? One of the findings is that subsequent to the protest, the women protesters received continued shaming from their communities, while others were arrested by police. Some of the women were expelled from educational institutions, and others suffered psychological distress. Some are still even suffering that psychological distress. One even passed away without having gotten any justice for the wrongdoing that was done to her by some of the community members. Moreover, women who protested against gender-based violence appeared to receive heavier sanction compared to those who protested in causes that did not center gender. The women protesters learned that naked body protests come at a cost. Mental health conditions that were suffered by some of the women were not anticipated, and the punitive effects that follow may be understood in relation to Rosie Braidotti's 2010 contention that change is a painful process. Some of the older women protesters from Dobsonville naked body protests chastised themselves because their naked protests appeared out of character and broke some of their own values of respectability. Because Tabisaiden said, I always ask myself a sorrowful question. I tried to explain to my kids why I stripped. I was trying to fight for them so that they could find their home. The younger women protesters, on the other hand, didn't feel the shame as much as the older women were feeling because they felt they had reached their end with end and it had to happen. So they spoke truth to power without fear of the consequences. This presentation was on the affective afterlife of naked body protest. The main thrust of the study was to find out the different layers of affect experienced by women protesters during protest and during our one-on-one interviews. Their stories and accounts were touching and I was affectively moved while conversing with my participants. Their accounts were nothing short of bravery, strength, and fortitude. The historical narrative of resistance by Dobsonville women was particularly moving. Pushed into a corner, they fought like wounded tigers to claw back their land. In one particular interview with a Dobsonville participant, I felt her pain, frustration, hopelessness, and joy throughout our interview. She also felt all the emotions all over again. What I carried home with me at the end of that meeting was her pain. I was numb. I could not shake myself out of that state immediately. This incident illustrates how affect and naked body protests have an affective afterlife that lingers after the protests have happened and move between bodies. In this regard, decades after a protest that I did not even participate in, I was affectively moved by the power of that protest. This is the last slide. My experience with student protesters was also touching and exposed another layer of affect. As an academic at heart and a doctoral student at the time of the interviews, it was only natural for me to empathize with their struggle for free education and justice. The fact that they used the naked body protest as a weapon of resistance echoed back to the Dobsonville women's naked body protest and also recalled the heady atmosphere of the 1976 youth uprising. Some of the younger women I interviewed have now become household names in the field of Black South African women's stand against inequality, injustice, and patriarchy because of their bravery. Thank you.
Thank you, Mpho. We're now going to go to the next paper, which is Nokwanda Dlamini. All right. Nokwanda is an honors student here at Rhodes University, and she's going to talk about the use of non-verbal language in Desmond Galgot's The Promise, analyzing the paradox of the unhappy slave.
This paper analyzes the question of justice as preserved over time by the active resistance and agency of the character Salome in The Promise. Salome in The Promise signals a sense of resistance to prejudice through her non-verbal state and uses of silence as a measure of time and patience to subject and convert a narrative of inferiority through the superiority of a more sensible person. In The Promise, the narrative changes from what was initially the superiority of her employers, the Swart family, which was part of the apartheid society through institutionalized racism, and change post-democracy into the disparate history of a people who are represented as being inhumane, while maintaining that post-democratic South Africa had failed to rise to its potential for all people within its borders. This failure is attributed and represented as a metonym of South African society just as much as Salome is a metaphor of all the women who use silence as a measure of self-control and discipline. This failure showcases the limitations of privilege and the ever-changing landscape in South Africa through tracing its history from 1985 to 2019. The novel is an example of whiteness studies, and the Swart family does not rise to their full potential to be a deity as far as a religious man or a faithful wife, as Astrid is having an affair, therefore cheating on her second husband, nor a talented writer, as Anton perceived himself to be, therefore representing the failure of unrealized dreams regardless of the opportunities available. This is a neo-modernist novel and uses streams of consciousness with a satirical, unnamed narrator who conveys the lived experiences of a white South African family and the domestic worker Salome who lives under their white gaze. The Swart family's lived experiences are captured in the time frame of 10 years in between and is narrated within a couple of days during the immediate family members' funerals from Ma in 1985 to Baamani in 1995 to Astrid in the early 2000s and her brother Anton in 2019. The unnamed narrator is a godly figure who places judgment on the characters and uses satirical, cynical, and ironic tone, which conveys disappointment at the family members' failures to do justice to their privileges, granted to them by a racial category and social hierarchy. This failure is showcased through exhibiting the Swart family members' flaws and immorality while maintaining false religion. This false religion results in them acting as anointed ornaments who deny Salome the justice of the promised land, which should be the Lombard place, therefore implicating the Swart family into a wider national narrative concerning the broken promises of the past, which has increased in the inequality in the country and left many poor and landless. Time as a measurement can signal changes. Damon Goggles' The Promise ushers South Africa into the 21st century. The Promise carries the tenements and similarities to J.M. Coetzee disgrace, challenging the narrative of realized freedom. It challenges it through showing the shackles that enslave domestic workers in what Gabeba Badurum calls the ghost in the house. The fragments in South African society showcase the limitations of nation building under the umbrella term the Rainbow Nation. These limitations are showcased through the fact that its most vulnerable people are subject to the status of marginalization. They are subject to the predicament of being overwhelmed with all the negativity of stifled manhood and the absence of the traditional barrier of the home being an intimate, private space. This space is one that places the performance of racial and gender roles as either private or public. This is made evident by Badiroon's analysis of domestic work in South African history. During apartheid, Black domestic workers lived within the margins of white private life. In this capacity, Black people could not have private lives, but could only service white domesticity. Therefore, the private lives of domestic workers were made structurally impossible. The private space is where one is surrounded by all the things that mark them as recognizably human and defined by the status of the people who they surround themselves with. This is predominantly evident in the disparities of South African society's treatment of women by the opposite gender, stereotyped as abusive and criminal. South African women are represented as ultimately abused by the male gender, therefore promoting the narrative of oppressing and posing a threat to women. Therefore, women are subject to two double-edged swords, one by male oppression and two by their race. For the longest time, silence has been seen in a negative light because it was equated with weakness and a lack of strength. However, in The Promise, Salome presents a loathsome figure of defiance and silent regard, with unhappiness always showing because of her treatment and status as a Black woman working as a domestic worker for the Swart household. In spite of the blatant racism she faces for her servitude, this paper argues that Salome is an unhappy slave, and that is her agency. In order to examine agency in relation to Salome's resistance to verbalize her anger and discomfort, this paper will analyze the representation of domestic workers or household servants in African society. The most prominent figure of the representation of domestic work is Krotoa, who was a servant and translator to Jan van Riebeeck when he first colonized South Africa. In literature, she has come from a narrative of racial prejudice, which labeled her as an unfit mother who was also immoral and untamed. Later on, her representation drew contestation as scholars began to represent her as the mother of the Rainbow Nation because of the fact that she had multiracial children. These contestations have made her become a historical figure in discourse concerning the treatment of household servants. The story shapes the early racial attitudes towards women who enter the private space of white households in order to perform the duties of servitude. Servitude, which is now referred to as domestic work, has been represented in film and literature such as Madam and Eve, and in literature by Sindiwe Magona's Living, Loving, and Lying Awake at Night. It has been represented as a performative space where one is subjected to an invasion of privacy where they have no legitimate life because their employers monopolize them. Domestic workers have been represented with a distorted power dynamic where capital was based on their subordination and compliance without complaint. The conflection of the South African words madame signaled that domestic workers were being asked to demonstrate that they understood their place. Therefore, it was based on putting one person's needs over another and a sense of a put down. Domestic work has also been represented as a product of apartheid, especially because of the rural and urban migration, where segregation meant that people would be left in drought-stricken, poverty-ridden places where they suffer the consequences of an unjust system which operated on a system of asserting difference. This is evident in the treatment of of Salome by Pa, Dlamini, Anton, and Desiree, who negate the intelligence of Salome and subject her to the humiliation of infantilization by calling her girl. This is similar to the stereotype representation of the household gardener, often called a garden boy, a taunt which asserts dominance and bestows inferiority. In linguistics, the meaning of these identity markers stands for a racial discourse and misrecognition of the human text, that is, domestic workers, which is addressed by Badiroon. The conflation of the South African words black woman and servant illustrates that black women's access to the public space is inextricably connected to a long history of domestic work in the country. Badiroon also argues that the terminology within the bounds of maid, girl, and servant were used in an offensive manner, which then put emphasis on a derision and disregard of household labor. The word girl is a correspondingly offensive term that merges servant and black woman. In the promise, Mpho overhears her sick mother making her father promise to give the Lombard place to Salome after she dies because Salome, their household maid, had nursed her throughout her illness. Ma then wanted to repay her through providing her with something to call her own. The nursing of Ma presents the conditions and expectations that were placed on Salome, presenting the indignity of having to be the one who saw Ma at her worst before her death. In the same passive way that Salome sweeps and cleans the house and washes the clothes of the people who live in it, she looked after Ma through her last illness, dressing and undressing her, helping her bath with a bucket of water and a lappy, helping her to the toilet, mopped up blood, all the jobs that the people in her family did not want to do. Too dirty or too intimate. Let Salome do it. That's what she's paid for, isn't it? After Ma's funeral, whose name was Rachel, Pa denies having made the promise, and Anton, who is Mpho's older brother, maintains that the promise cannot be fulfilled because of the laws forbidding the land ownership of black people in right areas. During this period, Salome Sin is praying for fate to be on her side and for the family to keep their promise. However, Pa renounces it and dies without having fulfilled the promise, therefore shadowing a notion of injustice in the novel. This injustice frames the story as an allegory concerning the dangers of willful ignorance to pursue one's own interests in the face of people suffering. The time frame of Ma's death is 1985, during the state of emergency and township protests to end apartheid. The imaginative abilities of the circumstances of the time are structured and told within a limit of privileged people afraid to lose their position of power, which is the Swart family made up of Pa, Ma, Anton, Astrid, Mpho, Dlamini, and Oki, her husband. Salome is thrust into the narrative as a silent figure of emotive expression, whose pain and suffering is evident without words, acting as a hyperbole of the wider society that didn't have the resources to be in the limelight. Trouble in all townships. It's being muttered about everywhere, even with the state of emergency hanging over the land like a dark cloud, and the news under censorship and the mood all over electrified. A bit alarmed, there is no silencing the voices that talk away under everything, like the thick crackle of static, whose voices are they? The voices, why can't we hear them now? Shh, you'll hear them if you pay attention, if only you listened. Salome, like the people in the rest of the country, were being subjected to what was an internal affair, in which the abuse of power was yielded and some people had the power to verbalize themselves, while others expressed themselves beyond the verbal. This is showcasing the expressive nature of Salome, who resists the notion of inferiority through using silence to convey that she had a higher moral standing, never confronting the barbs or slurs that Desiree subjects her to, while Anton continued to misrecognize her. Her presence in her household is ghostly. She is constantly performing the domestic duties of motherhood while being expected to shrink and make herself small. Her introduction is through the eyes of 13-year-old Mpho, who had come back home from boarding school to bury her mother Rachel. She is described in a manner that strips her bare and reveals the prejudicial attitudes of Mpho, who masquerades as an innocent bystander without a voice in her family to generate effective change. A stout, solid woman wearing a second-hand dress, given to her by her ma years ago, a headscarf tied over her hair. She is barefoot, and the soles of her feet are cracked and dirty. Her hands have marks on them, the scuffs and scars of immutable collisions. Same age as Ma, supposedly, 40, though she looks older. Hard to put an exact number on her. Not much shows in her face. She wears her face like a mask, like a graven image. This notion of wearing a mask is what frames Salome as a resistant figure in the face of oppression because she doesn't make herself small. She uses armor to guard her integrity and shield herself from associating with the family through preserving a privacy that is often denied to domestic workers. She was with Ma when she died, right there next to the bed. Though nobody sees her, she is apparently invisible, and whatever Salome feels is invisible too. The racist ideals and the promise of gendering domestic workers within the limits of racial categories under the surveillance and supervision of white people showcases the limitations of having complete lives. However, Salome subverts the narrative using passive resistance by showing indifference. The characters in the novel span to a lengthy 31 years after the promise was made. This signals the notion of passive resistance by Salome, who, in spite of knowing the fact that she was promised a home, which ironic is a home she already occupied, albeit useless to the Swart family, maintains the reserve of never hearing confirmation that her promise had been broken or vocalizing her personal feelings on the matter, but instead keeping the power of possibility available while the request had not been fulfilled, as it had not been rejected. The platform for her to speak is never presented, and Anton, who kills a township woman and deserts his post, showcases the consequences of active resistance, which in turn is responded to by violence. The female heads in the narrative, such as Sunny Mani, Mpho, Astrid, and Desiree, showcase the power dynamics, as Desiree, whose father was a perpetrator during apartheid, is subjected to the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, but Desiree still expresses herself as racist. Don't let him give the house to the maid, Desiree says, indignant. She'll only break it. In spite of her oppression, Salome expresses herself through non-verbal language and conveys her disappointment and unhappiness, which serve to highlight the injustices she faces. During a conversation with Mpho after Mani dies of a snake bite, Mpho learns to understand her pain and suffering without words. In many ways, Salome is enslaved by the promise because it binds her to the Swart family and creates a sense of failure to fulfill a certain promise of equality. Therefore, acting as a representation of the disappointment of the people within South African society, because it is framed through the time passages and changes in South African society between 1985 to 2019. Its concerns reveal the national question of land distribution, and Mamam, who is Desiree's mother, says it best. When white people fight, it is always usually about property, therefore highlighting the central concerns of the novel. This then showcases that an internal conflict that involves Salome had been taking place. It shows that she was intertwined into the lives as an equal but misrecognized agent in the story of the farm and its representation of racial and gender dynamics in South Africa. Mpho is the only ally she has. However, her prejudice leads her to having a white savior complex. When all patriarchal figures are eliminated, Mpho fulfills the promise made by Salome, because Salome had high expectations from her, which are eluded to after Mpho's return for Mani's funeral, which takes place during the Rugby World Cup, resulting in people ironically celebrating while the family mourns his death, caused by a snake bite because of Mani's criminal insanity and misguided beliefs about religion. How are you? I don't know. The first honest reply to this question today. Ah, shame, Salome says. She is noticeably older. The lines in her deeply scored, especially around her eyes. An expression of disappointment has started to harden, like the calluses that stricken the soles of her feet. She still wears no shoes. In this house, she will never wear shoes. I am sorry, she says. It doesn't have to be explained what she means, though she isn't mourning Mani, exactly. He didn't always treat her with respect, and not once in the time since Miss Rachel died has he brought up the issue of her house. Though maybe that was different now. Will you help me? It isn't spoken out aloud, but Mpho hears it as it is. She'll speak more, she says to Salome. In spite of Amo's response to Salom's expressive nature and ability to convey herself without words, Amo takes 20 more years to fulfill the promise because her brother Anton had the authoritative voice, and Amo was driven by a sense of unbelonging, which she attributed to being struck by lightning at the age of 6. Therefore, Amo's slowness and continual disappearance for years at a time leads to an embarrassment for Desiree and her mother after Anton kills himself because he cannot finish his novel, cannot have children, has a cheating wife, and is an alcoholic. In the end of the novel, all the women, Desiree, Amo, and Salome, seem to come together. Desiree finds sexual healing in her lover. Amo accepts her aging and lack of beauty, which has always been a bone of contention within her family. And Salome, who had decided to go back to her birthplace, is given a gift of money and the Lombard place by Amo in order to cure herself of the curse that the promise had laid bare upon her family's feet. This fulfillment of the promise comes with a set of clauses, such as the fact that Anton had once stated that the farm had come with Salome, which meant that the injustice of the servitude was akin to slavery and colonization. In spite of this, Salome does not stand for herself does not make a stand for herself makes a stand for herself in the most unexpected terms. Desiree and her mother find themselves humiliated by Anton at Anton's funeral, mainly because no one had a kind word for Anton's passing, and because Amo, the only living member of the family, is unavailable and unreachable. Until Salome intercepts the conversation and states that she can contact Amo, which leads to Desiree's mother putting her down, to which Salome simply responds, "You didn't ask me," which is the central concern of the novel. However, Salome's son Lucas confronts Amo about the promise, stating that the land belonged to his people and that the Swart family would pay for their racism, which is why Amo explains that Salome might lose the land even though it now belongs to her because there is a land claim on it. Therefore, the question of justice is raised again. Does the fallen nature of Swart's family's demise adequately compensate for the sense of betrayal that the family inflicted on her by using willful ignorance to ignore her humanity and desires? Or is the Swart family's demise a sign that Salome's lack of verbal speech but attendance of their funeral is the making of an art of war in which one must know their enemy and never make an offensive move? If so, does her unhappy slave narrative challenge the discourse or simply add to it? Well, the answer is that in literature, one can argue that misrecognition by the family creates a sense of unbelonging for her, which marks her as stateless, which in turn would be changed by her gaining a sense of belonging through ownership. And since she had already occupied the Lombard place, her need to own it is a need to own herself and gain her freedom from slavery, as she never gives the Swart family the satisfaction of owning her beyond her time to perform labor. As such, is a person of integrity and strength. Thank you.
That was quick, Nokwanda. That was very quick. Brendon, do you want the PowerPoint? Let me put this one up. You want to change
Okay, let me move. Question and answer session.
Sure. So my paper today was written when I was visiting Rhodes last academic year, so it's kind of nice to come back and speak to it. It's on Tsitsi Dangarembga's The Book of Not, which, if you've read it, you'll know focuses on Tambu's ethical project to do Hunhu, a version of Ubuntu, while she's being schooled in a secondary school in Sacred Heart Convent. And I view Tambu's kind of ethical project, as a kind of a failure. She tries to do the right thing, but it doesn't work out for her. She ends up, at the end of the book, effectively without a roof over her head. And I guess one of my questions that I've worked with in relation to the book is, why does trying to do the right thing not work out for Tambu? And my preliminary answer to that is perhaps because she tries to do the right thing in the wrong place. My two other kind of guiding questions, and I want to try to answer them towards the end of the paper, is it possible to do ethical accommodation in the context of political conflict? Because there's a civil war raging while Tambu is in the convent. And my second question is it possible to do ethical reciprocity in the context of racist exclusion? Because Tambu is being schooled in a predominantly and historically white religious school. So her schooling is designed to individualize her as an exception to black disadvantage in settler colonial Rhodesia. But her schooling also impedes the degree of success that she might achieve as a young black woman within that system. So, like, the fix is always in. And there's a kind of paradoxical gift of education that undermines her even as she progresses through it. So Tambudzai's colonial education restricts her political alliances with decolonizing insurgents, including her own sister, Netsai, who loses her leg by stepping on a landmine in a very traumatic opening chapter to the book. And Tambu, in fact, imagines escaping from the scene. Baba Mukuru, her uncle's being beaten by the insurgents for his kind of class and race affinities and his privilege. Tambu imagines fleeing on her sister's leg as it arcs through the sky. She imagines flying off like a witch. And the trouble there, perhaps, the kind of traumatic identification that's instilled, is with the injury, not with her own sister. So there's a kind of severance of identification, I think, that is happening in that moment, and that we can kind of see traced through the book more broadly. The second thing I want to say about colonial education is that it's institutionally rigged in advance to ensure Tambu's failure. And her response is to try to orient her ethics through the project of Hunhu, where one's own being is secured by one's recognition of another. I am well if you are well too, is her formulation of that ethical project. So I want to move on to how I see racism working in relation to Hunhu, and I'll tell you where this kind of comes from. I attended a talk by Sylvia Tamale, who was speaking about Ubuntu and jurisprudence, and advocating Ubuntu as a way of reworking judicial institutions. And I thought it was very, very compelling as an argument in that moment. But the question that popped up in my head, having just taught the Book of Not, is, well, what happens to Hunhu in the context of racism? And I was thinking particularly, and in Revolution, I was thinking particularly around Fanon's work and his writing of Black Skin, White Masks, that in a racist society, the black person has no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white person. And Fanon writes also that consciousness of the body is solely a negating activity. It is a third-person consciousness. In other words, there's no propositional framework for the I. That third person is a he or a she, or in the worst-case scenario, an it. And we see versions of that in the Book of Not, particularly there's an incident where one of the kids has Nesquik, one of the other kids asks for it, and the kid who is in charge of the Nesquik comments on her black classmate and says, their eyes are just like a cow's eyes. So, sort of a bestialization, a casual bestialization of the classmate. So racism, in Fanon's theorization of it, interferes with bodily coordination at the level of posture and gesture. It impedes the actional self. Fanon writes, in the white world, the person of color encounters difficulties in the development of their bodily scheme, and he gives an example of someone reaching up for a cigarette in a desk, and that thesis is continued, I think, in Wretched of the Earth, where we have a kind of spatialization of the colonial world, and an idea of the reclamation of humanity by changing the spatial distribution of that world, by overcoming the obstacles and barricades, by throwing out the colonizer through rehabilitative violence. So my way of thinking about Fanon's argument is that it advances Freud's thought on ego and object libido. And in a very brief kind of summary, Freud speaks about a kind of, a little like an amoeba, a kind of balance between libido invested in the self, ego libido, and libido invested in the object world, object libido. And the object in Freud's understanding can be a person, a loved one, an idea, the idea of the university, or a thing. So a kind of tripartite definition of the object. And what I see Fanon's argument in Wretched of the Earth, but also in Black Skin, White Masks, as being, is that he takes Freud into a kind of social and economic distribution of the psyche across colonial space. Oh, thank goodness. Technology's never my friend. They say it's the future. It really, really is not. So the stake of Fanonian proper personhood would be an activist change in the object world, a reordering of colonial space and its possibilities. Fanon writes about the thing that was oppressed by colonialism becoming human via the very process by which it frees itself, which he means is kind of overwhelming violence to take the colonizer's place. And so my argument is that for Fanon, the libido is not something interior to the self. It's also a psychic agency transacted in acquisitions, land and bread, in concerning violence, in Wretched of the Earth, and in detachments from the colonial world, shedding inferiority and inhibition. Now, the difficulty with Tambu's Hunhu, it's Dangarembga's kind of spelling or orthography for Hunhu, is that it has a non-violent and even non-confrontational character, despite the fact she finds herself in a very, very violent colonial confrontation, or anti-colonial confrontation, with her own family involved in the insurgency. And one of the things I kind of see at work in both this book, but also Nervous Conditions, and in the first few pages of the book of The Smallable Body, is a kind of dissociation of the self. Yes. I can try my very best. Where do I do that? Slideshow. Let's try. Does that work? Yeah. Aha. I may still get lost. So, for example, after Netsai loses her leg, Tambu's mother Mai speaks in an offended man's voice. Something else speaks through her. She is not herself. Something else is speaking. And Tambu concludes that night had invited unknown, patently evil spirits. Now, of course, while Tambu's fearing spirits, Mai's possessed masculine voice is iterating those spirits even in that moment. So what she fears is already kind of there. And there's a kind of misrecognition even of the moment in which she finds herself. The other thing is that the duty to aid Netsai after stepping on that landmine falls to Tambu as an elder sibling. But that kind of form of address, the elder sibling, is ironically split in the moment of address because the revolutionaries themselves are also called elder siblings, or Vana Mukoma, in the book. So kind of the space of the elder sibling is already split or bifurcated in that moment. So dissociation to the social subject of racism, I want to argue, is temporally and spatially dislocated. In the Book of Nat, Tambu struggles to hold back involuntary tears in the classroom. They're looking at a Roman text on invading armies, which of course is resonant for the moment of insurgency within which her schooling is taking place. And she also dissociates to the extent that her own arm will not obey her wishes. That also happens, of course, in nervous conditions when she separates out from her own body, when she doesn't want to go to the belated wedding of her parents. The other moment of dissociation and of involuntary embodiment happens when Tambu volunteers almost spontaneously to knit gloves for the settler army. In an act of what I'm calling dissociated involuntary embodiment, she writes or narrates, "Mine was among the arms that were raised." So there's a moment in which she knits for the wrong army, comforts the wrong limbs, not her sisters, and offers a disembodied arm among white arms. So I think there's a kind of both an immense likability of Tambu, but also a kind of implicit narrative critique of her identifications. And I think the project of Hunhu and Ubuntu lines up with that. So in relation to Hunhu, as the book calls it, the scale of systemic racism and the scale of civil war overwhelm Tambu's capacity for ethical choice. Reciprocity cannot work in the context of racism because there is no propositional framework for the I. And it cannot work in the context of civil war whose business is not the business of mutual wellness. It's in fact the opposite. So I've come up with four kind of assertions that I've written down in the longer piece that's about to be published on this topic. The formulation, I am well if you are well too, is perhaps retranslated by the Book of Nott into I cannot be well when my sister is maimed in war, so kind of the traumatic thesis that I've spoken about. I, Tambu, cannot be well when racist wellness requires my unwellness, in other words, when one is subject to settler colonial discrimination. I, Tambu, cannot be well when wellness depends on racists becoming unwell, in other words, the moment of decolonizing war. And finally, I, Tambu, cannot be well when I orient my ethics to the institutions, the school, the church, the army, that privilege some but make all unwell. I want to kind of conclude very, very briefly, since we're on about 13 minutes, barring technological glitches, by saying where I would have taken this piece in its longer version had the editors not intervened to say don't write about any of that Hunhu stuff that the Samkangis wrote about. One of the things you notice in the Samkangis, if you read the book on Hunhu, is that there is a kind of moment of punitive violence in relation to children who've misbehaved. So Hunhu, at least as the Samkangis write about it, does not preclude rehabilitative violence of a mode that Fanon might argue for. The other thing to say is that within some of the Samkangis' examples, there's a sentence where they say, one of the things we say is, there goes Umuntu with an Mlungu. Sorry for my Shona, it's possibly a misquotation and memory is not what it once was. But within that moment, and of course, Hunhu's built out of that, word, the root word for Muntu. So there is scope for kind of racial positionality and racial differentiation within Hunhu, at least as the Samkangi set it out. Unfortunately, the editors of the longer piece were far more keen on textual examples than African philosophy, but it will be reserved for a later piece. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Brendon. Yeah, you left us with 5 minutes, so we're doing well for time. We're now going to, in the meantime, ask Edgar to go up front, and Mpho and Brendon will all sit up front. I'll sit on the side, so that we will get questions and answers with more than one piece. And Edgar is reading this is not his paper, so I don't think we take questions.
according to the Mpho report of December 2021, Uganda hosts 1.5 million and about 50,000 asylum seekers, and of these, about 250 originate from war-torn South Sudan and live in a large refugee camp called Bididbidi in northern Uganda. The refugee settlement, which covers an area of 250 square kilometers, is prone to conflicts, and the common conflicts are mostly between refugees and host communities over access and utilization of resources such as land, water, and biomass fuel, and between the refugees themselves because of differences in ethnicity. Gender dimensions of the conflict in Bididbidi refugee settlement camp. As already observed above, most conflicts are fueled by competition for resources like water and firewood, which, with women being at the center, because they are the ones who mostly fetch water and collect firewood. Two ethnicity-related conflicts are sometimes occasioned by interethnic dating, with members of one ethnic group are choosing a member of a different ethnic group of sexual assault. There are many cases of gender-based violence, especially domestic fights between husbands and wives. Some of these arise from husbands selling the food they have received from the United Nations High Commission for Refugees in order to buy alcohol. Sometimes conflicts arise from husbands withdrawing young girls from school and marrying them for dowry. The respondents also informed me that because of drug abuse, some young men go on a rampage beating up people, mostly women, whom they think are incapable of defending themselves, and sometimes these young people rape the women. Finally, but not the least, there are instances where husbands randomly abandon their families because their wives have given birth only to girls. This is because in most African cultures, a boy child occupies an important position as a potential heir to the father, so giving birth to only girls is considered an incomplete fatherhood, a fatherhood with a gap since there is no heir yet. Two ways through which schools have responded to conflicts. One, establishing peace clubs, which are an avenue for students to discuss different ways of avoiding and diffusing conflicts so that the students and their communities from which they come can live in peace. In each school, the club is given two teachers to serve as the patron and deputy patron. Using an older technology of talking compound, limited to school compound, or of talking environment, combining the compound and the everywhere else in the school. The focus of the paper. This paper briefly reflects on how the talking compound serves as a peace-building strategy in two secondary schools in Bididbidi refugee settlement, Valley View and Highland, and what needs to be done to make this strategy even more effective owing to some of its limitations that I highlight. The data I use in this paper were collected from group interviews with the students of peace clubs in the two schools with special focus on the contributions of the students. Gender dimensions of peace clubs and talking compounds. One, the majority of the peace club members are girls. In the talking compounds, there are only two women represented, Mother Teresa and Dr. Maria Montesiro. While it is true that men are also seldom named on the boards, the religious texts used in the compound make it a male space, as there are several indirect references to male figures: Muhammad, Jesus Christ, St. Paul, St. John. The importance of talking compounds. The students underlined the different ways in which the talking compounds were helpful to them in communicating peace-building messages. One, through repetition, the boards in the compound make peace-building messages familiar and therefore part and parcel of the lives of the learners. They bring to mind the teaching of Chunzi, 340 to 55 BC, one of the greatest Chinese scholars, who states, thus, when I hear, I forget. When I see, I remember. When I do, I understand. The messages are a reference point as students can ask each other, did the board tell us what, that we should use a polite language, or what, isn't it written on the boards that we should forgive those who wrong us? Number 3, the messages introduce students to heroes that they need to read more about. For instance, Dr. Maria Montessori and Mother Teresa of Calcutta. 4, the messages also highlight the place of the major foreign religions in the country, Christianity and Islam, in peace building. As many quotations dotting the compound come from the Holy Bible, e.g., for he himself is our peace, who has made us both one, Ephesians 2:14, and the Holy Quran, but do good, for all lovers those who do good, Surah 1a, Baqarah 195. The limitations of the talking compounds, because the messages are too common, they lose their urgency with the time as they are taken for granted. 2, the messages are placed in compounds without pathways, so some of them are hardly seen. 3, boards bearing the messages are of different sizes and designs, each of them in a different color or set of colors. This has the potential to make the talking compound a shouting one in terms of aesthetics, disharmony, because of top-down approaches to administering the schools in refugee settlement. The messages are handed to the schools already written and designed, so the schools do not participate in creating them or even deciding where they are planted in the compound. No message is given from African traditional religions. There are no messages by Ugandan, East African, and African peace builders. Gender-specific limitations of the teaching compounds. There are 3 major limitations of talking compounds as a technology of communicating peace. 1, the first one is its origin in sexual education messaging, particularly the focus on HIV prevention messages. This biases the way these messages. Am I doing well for time? Oh, okay. These messages on peace building are communicated. The sex education messages mostly target the girl child as the site of sexual activity. She is the victim, while the predator is the male as an adult, say her teacher, or a fellow child, say a boy. This victim-predator binary has continued to be reflected in peace building messages, with some women being considered as the victims of aggression who should become peace builders by turning the other cheek to their aggressors, the males, men and boys. One female student protested the way girls are depicted in the talking compound thus, quote, most of the message target girls as the vulnerable members of the population. True, a message like avoid bad touches is important because a bad touch can lead to temptations and even to a fight as the person touched protests the intrusion. But why is it taken for granted that the toucher is a boy and the touched is a girl? Why are girls always depicted as the vulnerable members of the population? We need messages that challenge this. Close quotes. I understand the students to say that there is already some gender stereotyping in the messaging of the talking compounds that needs to be problematized so that we appreciate the fact that the aggressor is not always a man and the victim of aggression is not always a woman. The reverse is possible, and the talking compound needs to reflect this possibility. Number 2, the second limitation is that the compound has a patriarchal gaze, mostly because the majority of the peace-building messages come from the Holy Bible and the Quran, the Holy Quran, books in which the male voice is dominant. True, there are some women peacemakers, Mother Teresa of Calcutta and Dr. Maria Montessero, who are referenced in the compounds, but they are too few. Besides, it is unlikely that students do not know who these women are and what they stand for as far as peace building is concerned, over and above the statements attributed to them. 3. Finally, as already mentioned, the messages are delivered to schools already created and designed in Kampala, the capital city of Uganda, where most NGOs are headquartered, meaning that the students do not have any input as far as the texts and design of the boards on which the texts are put are concerned. This is why one female student asked the question that is reflected in my title: why aren't our voices on peace building represented in this place? One female member of the Peace Club had this to say, quote, "There are many problems in our community that have not been captured in the talking compounds. For example, gender-based violence, tribalism, and drug abuse. We need messages on these vices. For instance, stop gender-based violence, embrace ethnic diversity, drug abuse kills community." Another female student said that as young people, they had rich experience that need to be reflected in the talking compounds. The executive of non-government organizations active in the refugee settlement should not take the student as a blank slate on which messages from Kampala should be written. Conclusion: the female students I talked to while conducting this research may not be as assertive as Amahato Adoi's sister Pure Joy, but they raised a number of issues that deserve attention. And these issues include that organizations active in Bididbidi refugee settlement should involve students in creating and designing the peace messages planted in compounds, i.e., the organization should not take the students should not make the students mere consumers of the message, but active agents who produce these messages. That the organizations twist the framing of the message so that they do not position women as always victims, but as people can and do hold their staff with amazing results. And 3, that organizations include quotations of women peacekeepers from Uganda, e.g. Honorable Betty Bigombe, who negotiated peace with the Lord Resistance Honorable Reader Joseph Kony, even if without success, and other amazing peace builders like Honorable Professor Wangari Maathai of Kenya, who won the Nobel Peace Prize. Works cited, I will spare you that.
Please.
Thank you.
Thank you, Edgar, Mpho, Nokwanda, and Brendon, for all keeping to time and making my life much easier, because we're already running late. Can we have one round of questions for all of our speakers before we go to tea? Dinner, number 1, you can start while other people are thinking.
Thank you so much. All of it was fascinating, and I can see the thread that links all of them. It was wonderfully put together. My question is to you, Mpho. Okay. My question is, I wonder what and how the idea of risk is weaved into your work, especially if you think about risk as a way in which those who protest get into that space of protest, right? And the kind of possible fear with which you go into that protest, right? And so that if then you think about risk alongside ideas, feelings of fear and courage, right? how can you theorize that risk? And I'm here thinking about Judith Butler's work, precarity and being in that space but doing it anyway, as well as Sarah Ahmed's ideas around taking risk and knowing what it means, right? So I wonder how that weaves into your work. Okay, that's one. The second thing that popped up when we were speaking was the idea of intergenerational frictions and textures that are generative, right? Because you look, if you compare, because you do that comparative work, and what it means, because obviously you're getting different results from the two or the various groups, right? So what is that friction enabling for you as a person who's thinking about these intergenerational frictions? Which then leads me to the question of what does it mean to do these protests as a woman now? Okay, especially in an age of hyper-visibility with the digital media, right? What does that mean for you? Because you said something about the now generation not embracing the shame, right? In a similar way, and I'm very, very intrigued because you talk more about the mental health traces with the now generation than, I'm not saying the other generation did not, but the shame and the stigma was so much more then than it is now in a very different and interesting way. So I wonder what you do with that. And the last, and linked to that is the idea of the archive of this afterlife, right? The reference to the lingering archive in the age of digital media. So, and the last has to do with the laughter. I've always been fascinated by laughter, and especially that laughter that reminds you of your place, right? And one of the questions, one of the things you shared had something to do with laughing at how the breasts look. And I know exactly who you're quoting here. And I was very annoyed then, and I'm still annoyed. But I've always wondered about how we think about that laughter, and how you would theorize that laughter, and read against it, and put it out there and say, this is what this laughter is doing in terms of disciplining the body.
All right. Mpho, let's see if there's other questions. I don't think you answer all Dina's questions, so let me get you off the hook for that. But you can answer one. Shirley?
This one's for Brendon. I think Tambudza is, I'm not even sure if it's a question, but Tambudza has always been, coming to her, and this young African girl's voice was very, very influential to me as a person. And problematic as that voice was. Because it's like when I read, Jane Austen's work and the range of women characters, Fanny was I would just like to take her and shake her. She's just so passive. And what it means to be put into the minds of that kind of passivity. And this person that, in a way, refuses to be well, as you're saying. But I guess maybe if I had to ask a question, does it really mean that if we are situated within systems that are unwell, that then leads to unwellness? And a sustained unwellness? Because I'm thinking about whether you're thinking about Achebe, or whether you're thinking about Ngugi, or whether you're thinking about, Nawal. These are all people that grew up, and many of us that grew up within systems of unwellness. And I think something about the sister Killjoy is that they recognize those systems. So, you move from that interiority of feeling like something's wrong with you, and then starting to understand there's something wrong with the world. And then you start battling that. And of course that is, because even I think in the second one, Dangarembga shows us that colonial education is not the kind of education that's going to set you free and help you to reach where you. But what is, I guess I'm wondering about if you can as an author create any character, and we are forced into the minds of pedophiles in Morrison's work, or in terms of the kind of passivity that Mpho sometimes often exhibits. What is that forcing doing to us who are reading as readers, and especially as Sister Killjoys, in also understanding that passivity as a kind of refusal, passivity as a kind of inner understanding of this world, but not always are having the tools to change things.
Okay. Any question? More questions? Yes?
I don't know if this is a question, but something I found really interesting about Brendon's presentation. I think in the beginning you said something about why does trying to do the right thing not always work out in the ways that we wish it would. And then you then answer by saying that maybe it's because we're trying to do the right thing in the wrong place. And that just got me thinking about what constitutes right and wrong, and all these beliefs that we have about what is right and what is wrong. And I further started questioning that even with thinking about Mpho's presentation, and the shame and the afterlife of this shame. But what constitutes right and what constitutes wrong? I think, is it a question? I think that's my mind, where my mind is at.
Okay. Yes?
I have a question for Mpho. I was wondering, how you rate nakedness versus nudity. I was wondering, if the shame comes from the fact that maybe their bodies were sexualized, eroticized. Because for me, breasts are just breasts in the naked eye. But then in the patriarchal pornographic imagination, then now there comes these notions of this body belongs for me, for my eyes only, in the bedroom. So I was just wondering, how you rate nakedness versus nudity.
Corey?
To carry on from that question, sorry, Mpho, you had answered there.
You guys are going to have to remind me some of the questions anyway. It's fine. Yeah.
Sure.
Yes.
I think what is interesting about those protests, you've analysed it. Are you psychologist? Did you come from it from
Department of Psychology, yes.
Okay, yeah. Because that makes sense, because I think to psychologize this brings it to the individual. But these naked protests are always with the collective in mind. So it's very much, I'm not just this individual with these breasts. I am stripping off for something that I'm collectively furious or beyond words about. It's that kind of thing. And I think it's very hard. I think for the younger women who engaged in this protest, it was a very different feeling, because I was here, and it was a collective thing. But then, as soon as everyone's standing there in their nakedness, cops come, photographers come, everyone's standing around checking out the boobs, and it was horrible, because you're not just the collective, you're switching between the individual and the collective as well. And I kind of feel like the healing for the traumas that people felt afterwards needed to be a solidarity, needed to be a collective debriefing in a way, and I think perhaps the young women were unprepared for firstly what that horrible response, which reduced them to individualized naked nude bodies rather than legitimate protesters with a real issue. So, I think I would have liked to see a little bit more troubling of what we hold in our bodies is not just shame. There's also a sense of, I did that. I was brave. You know, there's that complexity of courage and shame and all of the other things that are housed in that body, to the point where perhaps that one person was left in a catatonic state of not being able to do anything because there was just too much going on. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. I'd like to start with your question what you've just said while I still remember. So, my work was divided into 4 subsections.
Yeah.
So, today's work was just focusing on those negative after effects that they went through.
Okay.
But what you're saying when you say, I did that, there's a part in my findings where I focus on where they say, yeah, I did that. It had to be done. That's under the section called When the Body Speaks, where I tell what does it mean to expose your breasts to the women? What does it mean to expose your vagina? What does it mean to expose the buttocks? So all of those different parts of the body have different meanings, and the women there were not shameful in that part of the findings. But in this particular subsection, I was focusing on what happens to these women. Yes, they did that. They were brave. They were strong. They had to do this thing for the next generations and for themselves as well. But what do they sit with after that we do not see behind closed doors when they go home, when they go to their different rooms, those who were on campus, when they go to their different families, those who stayed off campus? What do they sit with after this? Because I realized that there was not much written about that. Even us as researchers, when you go out there to interview the people, you go home and you sit with these findings that you've just found from your participants, and there's no debriefing necessarily for you as well as the researcher or the interviewer. What you sit with as well. The pain that...
Paul, can you also quickly go to the next... So
okay, cool. Okay, we'll take it offline. Let me start with
Dina.
Dina. I'll answer one question for Dina, and then we'll discuss it offline. The one where you talked about the risk for the protesters. So under the section where I look at the psychosocial role played by the naked body protest, one of the Dobsonville women said to me, we knew that we were going to die. But what was the difference? You're sitting here, you do not have a home, you do not have a right to housing, you do not have a right to anything. You're seen as a child under the apartheid government. So whether you sit or you protest, you're going to die anyway. So better do something that might end up giving positive results. So they knew the risk, and they were prepared for it, and they knew that they were going to die. And I remember she even said to me, when the police came with their, those big cars, the women themselves, would even protect the men and go and stand in front of the men naked, because then they realized that these police were afraid of their nakedness. So when the police would approach the men, they would quickly run in front of the men to also protect the men, because they had told themselves, we're going to give it all out, because either way, the situation will not change. So you have to do something at least positive to say, even if I die, maybe freedom will come, or something better will come from my bravery. And then there was another question about nakedness versus nudity. So I made a difference. I talked about nakedness, I talked about nudity in my work, where I differentiate and say nakedness is agentic, because you take that agency and you are making the decision to say, I'm stripping my clothes and I'm taking agency for my own body. Nobody's going to tell me what to do with my body. It's my body, and I'm going to go out there and strip to fight for my rights. So I use nakedness as a way of showing one's agency and of taking back and claiming back their body. Whereas nudity, of course, you're going to be sexualized. But with nakedness, you make that decision yourself to be naked in public.
Okay, I'm just cutting you off now.
Yes.
Let Brendon say something, and then I'll make a comment for Nokwanda and Edgar.
tie passivity and right and wrong together in one answer, if I can. Thanks for great questions. I think one of my questions is around where Tambu has leeway for choice in a system that both privileges her, but erases her and her relations with her family. And I think that rightness probably consists in negotiating a path to those relations and to some form of self-actualization. The person who does move from passive to resistant across the two books is Netsai. She carries her brother's bags, but she's a competent in that first chapter. I think there are two answers as to where the book resists maybe that passivity. And the one might be in what the narrative voice gives away that Tambu's thinking hasn't yet discovered for itself. So it undermines her, and in that we find a kind of agency, the agency of the Tambu who is told rather than the Tambu who thinks of herself as telling. The second example is Ntombi, who's been Tambu's antagonist. They get into fight at one point, they see the world differently. Ntombi identifies with the insurgency. When Tambu's denied the school honours prize, and it's given to someone who's good at swimming but not very bright and just happens to be white, and Ntombi reaches out and says, let's challenge this. So despite their differences, the recognition of someone else's suffering and the recognition of someone else's struggle, and perhaps an idea of difficult solidarities might be one way of resisting that passive framing. But it's a great question. I don't really have an answer.
All right. Thank you so much, Nokwanda. My question, which you don't have to answer, but I would like you to think about now, because we're running out of time. Your presentation, you've done a lot on your essay. Is how does the narrative structure or the narrative techniques speak to what it is you're analyzing, in other words, the non-verbal. Can you just think about that, and we can talk about this offline. Edgar, as you're an interlocutor, so I don't know if this, but the idea of the talking compounds is something that I find quite, like, it's not just in the refugee camps. I find it in many schools. I mean, the schools I went to in Uganda didn't have talking compounds, but when I go back now to visit, there are these talking compounds. So it's interesting, and I don't know if it's a purely East African thing, is it a Ugandan thing, because we really don't have talking compounds here in Southern Africa. But you're not going to answer me now, because we have to go, and I have to be back here to present my paper at 12 o'clock, which is in 7 minutes' time. So thank you so much for being here, for engaging, and thank you to our speakers for engaging and for wonderful papers, and for sticking to time. Thank you so much.